Wow. And it's not every day I meet another Justin as well. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's lovely to be with you this evening in, was it the middle of nowhere, Texas? Is that how you describe Midlothian? Anyway, it's wonderful. It's only, I think, the third time I've been in Texas, so it's lovely to be with you. Thank you so much for hosting me. I want to use this evening to give a little background to what I've been doing over the last several years, working in what is technically called apologetics, or the defense of faith. But as Justin said there, I think there has been quite a shift in the way we need to talk about God in our culture at the moment. And partly the book that I've written, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and the podcast series that accompanies it, is talking about that change and how I've seen things change over the last few years. And I hope some of the lessons that come out are relevant to your situation here in Texas. And we're going to make sure, of course, that there's plenty of time for questions towards the end of the evening. So please, if anything strikes you, do kind of make a note of that, and I'll be delighted to pick it up later in the Q&A. So the book that I've written begins with a quote from a well-known poem by a Victorian poet, Matthew Arnold. The poem is titled Dover Beach, and it was written 150 years ago, and it's got this well-known phrase in it, in which it says, "The sea of faith was once too, at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar." Now, this is a poem and a stanza from a poem that's been quoted many times over the years to sort of represent the way in which faith has essentially gone out in the West. And in many ways, that long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith has only accelerated in the 150 years since Matthew Arnold wrote that poem. We've seen science and secularism kind of come to dominate Western thinking, the academy, and in many ways, a lot of people have quoted this phrase from Matthew Arnold, essentially saying, well, this is the story of Christianity. It's kind of doomed to ultimate extinction in the West. That's how the story ultimately ends. But I had an interesting interaction with a secular thinker a few years ago who kind of put a different spin on this for me. You may or may not have come across Douglas Murray. He's an interesting secular thinker in the UK, the associate editor of The Spectator magazine, a journalist, and someone who doesn't claim to have a Christian faith. Any faith he did have kind of sputtered out in his sort of late teens, early 20s. We were contemporaries actually at Oxford University, but he's gone on to much bigger and better things than me. But I was hosting a conversation with Douglas Murray as one of the participants, and he raised this well-known quote from Matthew Arnold's poem about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. But he said to me, well, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is that it could come back in again. After all, that's the point of tides, right? And he was saying this in the context of having been quite surprised to see a number of his contemporaries reassessing Christian faith, giving it a second look. And even some of his peers, thinking, intelligent, rational people, actually becoming Christians, to his surprise. And I was noticing something similar to what Douglas Murray was seeing. I'd noticed a real change in the temperature, in the tone of the conversations around me. And I wondered, but perhaps there might be something in that. And that was really the catalyst for the title of the book, and in many ways the kind of graphic on the book and podcast, this incoming tide. Because I think Douglas Murray is probably right. I think we may be due for a turning of the tide when it comes to Christianity in the West. Because for a very long time, we all know what the statistics have been, especially in my home country, the UK. There's been a gradual diminishing of faith being passed on from generation to generation. Recently in the UK, we had the lowest ever number of people put down Christianity on the census as kind of their kind of default religious position, if you like. And we've seen really huge decline in church attendance. And as I say, a lot of people assume, well, that's simply the story, right? That's the direction we're going. But actually, I think there's a different story to be told. I think there's something going on in our culture which doesn't actually necessarily get represented in the statistics that we're often quoted about the decline of Christianity in the West. One of the things that is sort of part of my story is that I started to host conversations on faith about 17, 18 years ago. I began a show called Unbelievable, and it very much began in the heyday of a movement that was known as the New Atheism. So in around the mid-2000s, a group of quite sort of dogmatic, anti-theistic, secular public thinkers started to publish anti-God books. And they came to, these four at least, became known as the Four Horsemen of the New Atheism. This was a very dismissive, ridiculing form of atheism. They were out to essentially dismiss and disparage religion. It came hot on the heels of 9/11, so a lot of them were acting out of a kind of a sense that religion is bad for us, bad for the world. And also it was led by people who were often scientists or sort of philosophical thinkers and so on. And it kind of had this view that ultimately belief in God, belief in Christianity, belief in religion generally was a delusion. In fact, that was the title of the best-selling book of the gentleman on the far left, Richard Dawkins, a biologist. He published this best-selling book, The God Delusion, in 2006, right around the time that I began this faith discussion show, Unbelievable. And some of the interesting things that were going on at that time included things like there was an atheist bus campaign in London. This was in 2009, and there were literally red London buses circulating the capital in London, bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And this was the flavour of New Atheism. It was this very in-your-face form of non-belief. It became very trendy, really, to be an atheist at that time. And so when I started a discussion show in which I was bringing people together for dialogue and debate on a Christian radio station, it very much was at a time when these debates were hot in our secular culture. These big kind of characters, quite combative personalities were asking big questions of Christianity. They were getting a lot of column inches. They were releasing video shows. There was the growth of kind of atheist conferences around the world. And so I found myself in the middle of a lot of interesting conversations as I invited some of these well-known characters into discussions to debate the rights and wrongs of Christianity. I decided that actually, as I'd sort of come into broadcasting as a sort of Christian myself, someone who wanted to share the Word of God with others, I felt that I was being called to actually do it through apologetics, through the rational defense of Christian faith. And that was really where the show Unbelievable was born. And I ended up hosting hundreds of these conversations between Christians and non-Christians. And as I say, in those early days of the show, in the mid-2000s, it was very much typified by these quite combative debates between these new atheist type thinkers and the Christian thinkers that I would bring on opposite them. And it was invigorating. I learned an awful lot in the process, and I was glad to say that in the process of hosting many, many conversations, not just with atheists, but people of other faiths and agnostics, and also, other Christians, and debating different theological positions, I came to see that actually Christianity really can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. There's this very strong, rich, historical, intellectual tradition in Christianity. But I also began to notice a real change in the nature of the conversations during the time that I was hosting the show over about 17 years. Starting with these very combative debates with the new atheists, I started to notice a shift in the kinds of folk that I was engaging. More often than not, I would often find that the non-Christians I was inviting onto the show for dialogue and debate would actually often say, well, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. I'm not one of those new atheists. I'm not here to ridicule and dismiss religion. And what I found instead was that actually, over time, for various reasons, the new atheism itself began to wane. This movement that had started out very strong, very confident, very strident in its tone, started to suffer all kinds of issues. It started to have all kinds of internal meltdowns and started to actually, some of the key leaders of the new atheism kind of started to disagree with each other quite vehemently. You could say that once the new atheists had agreed that religion was bad for you and God didn't exist, it turns out they really couldn't agree on much else, because they started to have all kinds of fallouts about sort of particular issues in culture. You could say the culture wars came early for New Atheism. Particularly, there was a wing of the New Atheists who felt actually we need to move away from being represented by 4 white guys, basically, and we need to go in a kind of more socially justice motivated direction. But there were people who wanted to kind of rebrand as Atheism Plus. That was a kind of an atheist movement with additional kind of sort of convictions around LGBT and feminism and other issues. Whereas there was another wing of the atheist movement that said, no, we don't want any of that. That's just political correctness. We just want to be this free-thinking oasis. You know, we don't want any political dimension to this movement. And these two sides fell out quite dramatically, to the point where Richard Dawkins himself, the leader, if you like, of this movement, was himself stripped in 2021 of his Humanist of the Year award by the American Humanist Association because of his comments on transgender. That was a big issue that kind of split the atheist community down the middle, and got to the point where atheist conferences were being cancelled because the speakers refused to share a stage with each other. They'd fallen out with each other so dramatically. So there was an interesting kind of internal unraveling of the New Atheist movement itself. But more than that, as someone watching from the sidelines as this was happening, I felt that ultimately the New Atheism hadn't really answered people's fundamental questions. They'd held out science and reason as the answer to all of life's questions. And science and reason are really good for some things, but they won't buy you a meaningful life. That's ultimately not what science is there for. It's not there to tell you, it might tell you sort of what you're made of and how you came to be at some level, but it won't tell you why you're here. It won't tell you what the value of your life is. And I found that in the end, a lot of the questions that simply hadn't ultimately been answered by the New Atheists were still left hanging in the air. And people were still looking to find answers to questions around meaning and purpose and identity. And so what I noticed is, as the years went by, I noticed that increasingly as kind of this New Atheist phase waned, a new set of secular thinkers was starting to pop up and draw people in the absence of the New Atheist speakers. One of them joined me in 2018 on the show. The gentleman on the right is Jordan Peterson, and he's become something of a cultural phenomenon in the years since. But this was at a time when I was seeing more and more secular thinkers starting to talk far more positively about Christianity. This was where this change was happening. And Jordan Peterson is one of the people, I think, who typifies this new kind of tone to the conversation that we're seeing. And we'll return to him a little bit later on in the talk. But in this particular instance, he joined me for a conversation on whether we can make sense of life without God. And opposite the lady on the left of the picture, who's an atheist psychologist, Susan Blackmore. And so they joined me for an edition of my Unbelievable show where we were debating this. Now, interestingly, under normal circumstances, one of the guests joining me would have been a Christian, one an atheist. But in this case, neither of them would necessarily describe themselves as Christians, but you would have been forgiven for thinking that Jordan Peterson was a Christian apologist. So fervently did he defend the idea that ultimately we can't make sense of our value if we don't think of ourselves as made in the image of God. And so this was just a fascinating kind of thing going on at that time in the culture. And as I say, we'll return to Jordan Peterson and some other folk in a moment's time. But essentially, the book and podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is me trying to tell the story of the way the conversation has changed in our culture in recent years, and hopefully to help the church as well, just as Justin was saying, to understand that actually there's different questions being asked now than perhaps 10 or 15 years ago at the height of New Atheism and that sort of movement. The book on the far right of that is the first book I published, which was sort of published around the 10-year mark of me hosting these conversations, named after the show and subtitled Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. The new book, as I say, with the wave on the cover, is the new one, which is more looking at what's happening in our culture right now. It's a snapshot of what's going on. So I would recommend, if you want a kind of into these issues, as well as taking away the book. If you're a podcast listener, check out The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. That's a sort of documentary style podcast where I really dig into some of these issues, talk to a lot of people about what's happening in our culture at the moment. But for the rest of my talk, I want to present essentially three ways in which I think the God conversation has been changing over the last several years in our culture. And I want to present this in the format of asking what is the best explanation for three aspects of human experience. Three reasons, if you like, to believe in God. But along the way, I want to introduce you to some of these new secular thinkers who are often pointing people in the direction of Christian faith. Very different in terms of their approach and their answers to the new atheists who are very deliberately pointing people away from Christian faith. And I think we're in a unique moment when that tide may just be turning. We just may be in a moment when people are more open than they have been in a long time in our secular post-Christian culture to re-examining the Christian story and hearing it afresh. So I'm going to give you three areas where I think this is happening. The first is that I believe there's increasingly a sense in our culture that God makes sense of human existence. Now, this was obviously a key tenet of the new atheism. It was led by scientists who were very, dogmatic in their insistence that actually you're here by chance, that ultimately you're the product of completely material, natural causes, and you just happen to be, the outworking of an otherwise uninterested universe. We certainly don't need God now that we have science. That was essentially the mantra of the new atheists. The more we know about science, the less reason we have to believe there's a God behind any of this. But actually, I think when you actually look at what's been happening in science over the last 100 years or so, there's a very different story that can be told, actually. I think there's various ways in which the story that science disproves God is actually working in the opposite direction. I think there's a lot of evidence coming about now to show that actually there is a God behind the science, that actually the more we know about the universe, the more it opens up the God question rather than closing it down. One of the first sort of ways in which this kind of became apparent to me as I was hosting conversations in the early years of my show was bringing on Christians who were scientists opposite scientific atheists. And one of the subjects that came up quite frequently was a phenomenon called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. This may be something some of you have come across before, but it's just a fantastic and fantastically interesting fact that our universe appears to have been birthed from the moment of its conception with just the right numbers and values and laws to be able to sustain life in the future, you and me. Now, it's a kind of a mind-boggling concept, so I decided to create a video about it a few years ago, just boiling it down to about 4.5 minutes, and using a dice as a kind of an example of how you might think about what the odds are of you and I being here. So just for a few minutes, I'm going to let a video do the talking and explain a little bit about what this concept of the fine-tuning of the universe for life is and how it relates to God. So sit back and enjoy.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the cosmic dice. Like the gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose in the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it all. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe them, and nor should you. If I roll this dice, the chances of getting a 6 is 1 in 6. That's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, the odds get longer. It's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. So I'd have to be pretty lucky to get 2 6s in a row. Now, every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times, and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded, maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it. Believing in God isn't a delusion. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion when we look at the fingerprints on our universe. And if it's true that we aren't just the fluke result of a cosmic roll of the dice, and that we're actually here because a grand designer intended us from the very beginning, well, that's worth staking something on.
It's a pretty amazing phenomenon, this fine-tuning of the universe for life, and it seems to cry out for an explanation beyond the universe. And so I've been fascinated to host a lot of these dialogues with thinkers who are looking at the science, at what it took for you and I to be sitting here today and saying, well, it feels like actually, at the end of the day, it's difficult to reconcile with a purely naturalistic, atheistic view of the world. And really what I'm simply asking most people when I kind of present them with evidence for the existence of God, I'm simply asking them to consider two different alternatives. I'm not saying that I can provide a kind of cast iron argument for the existence of God, but I'm saying we all have to stand kind of looking at the world from our perspective, our worldview, if you like. And I may be over here as a Christian, and yeah, I've got my beliefs about God and about, the nature of life, Jesus, the supernatural. And I may have an atheist friend over here who says, well, look, it's your job to convince me of all those funny beliefs that you hold. But I would want to say to my atheist friend, well, hang on, I'm not the only one with a set of beliefs. You over here as an atheist, you also have a set of beliefs. In my experience, most of the atheists that I met on the Unbelievable show while I was hosting it subscribed to some form of what you might call naturalism, the view that all that exists is matter in motion, that ultimately everything can be reduced to the laws of nature, chemistry, energy. Now that is a way of looking at the world, but it's got some implications to it. It means that ultimately you believe the universe came from nowhere and is heading nowhere. There's no overall story, there's no overall purpose to the universe or to life. That all the things we often take for granted about life in terms of beauty, truth, justice, right and wrong, they're ultimately illusions that have been foisted upon us by a purposeless process. Now, fine if you want to take that perspective, but I'm going to have to ask you some questions as well about your worldview. I'm not the only one who needs to provide evidence in that sense for my worldview. I want to have a good conversation with my atheist friend about why they believe what they believe. And what I've discovered in the process of kind of looking at various areas of human experience and human existence, I've noticed that actually it seems to fit better very often with the Christian worldview than with the atheist worldview. And I think the fine-tuning of the universe for life is one of those areas. Human existence seems to be crying out for an explanation that an atheist account that deals purely in chance and time can't explain. I think it fits far better with the Christian view that there is a mind behind the universe that intended for us to be here. But it's not just Christian thinkers like me who are saying this kind of thing. Increasingly, in recent years, I've been bumping into a lot of secular thinkers, including scientists, who are talking in these terms too. Someone I've had the pleasure of interviewing a few times over the last few years is Paul Davies, who's a science popularizer based at Arizona State University. He's an Englishman, but he moved out here a while ago, and he's written a lot of best-selling popular-level science books, contributed to a lot of TV series and things. And Paul Davies is an interesting person because he doesn't describe himself as religious, but nonetheless, he wouldn't describe himself as an atheist either. And he's been something of a thorn in the side of many of his kind of new atheist colleagues and peers, because when Paul Davies talks about the universe himself, he recognizes that there's something very interesting going on in the universe. He's written about what it took for us to be here, thinking, perceiving, conscious, intelligent beings in the universe. And he realizes that it's very hard to explain that from a purely naturalist position. He not only talks about the fact of the fine-tuning of the universe, but also the fact that there is a universe, that it appears that the universe came into being 13.8 billion years ago. The fact that there is life on Earth, and just the extraordinary complexity involved in getting a self-replicating molecule of DNA going. And when I last spoke to him about these issues, he said something really interesting to me. He put it this way. He said, Justin, the directionality in the universe, going from matter to life to consciousness, he said, I would add comprehension to that. He said, there's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And he said, if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me conveys something close to something like a meaning or purpose in nature. He said, I think that's a sort of religious feeling, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. Now, when I hear that from someone like Paul Davies, it's worth sitting up and listening, because this is someone who is not a Christian, is not particularly advocating for faith or for God, but he recognizes that there's something about the universe that science is revealing to us that says there's a purpose behind it. There's something deeper going on. And when Paul Davies talks about this arrow in the direction of us, in the direction of comprehension, it reminds me of a Greek word, actually, that you'll find in the Gospel of John, the word logos. And it's this word that conveys the bringing of order out of chaos, the speaking of meaning into meaninglessness. And it's, of course, the word that is used of Jesus Christ as the word who speaks life into being. I think that's the perfect word to describe what Paul Davies is talking about when he says there's this kind of logos behind life. And I find it really interesting when the best of science and scripture kind of come together in that interesting way, and you find that actually more and more scientists are talking this way. I'm finding more and more people in the mainstream scientific community who are questioning this kind of default atheist naturalist position that has been dominant in the sciences for a long time. More and more people like Paul Davies who are saying, no, there's more to this story. I think there's a surprising rebirth of belief in God happening right there in the mainstream scientific community in all kinds of interesting ways. So I think God is the best explanation of human existence. But I also think God is the best explanation of human value. Now, for this, we instead of looking out there in the universe for evidence, I think we look inside ourselves. I had a really interesting conversation with Richard Dawkins, sort of around the time, again, that the new atheism was really building a head of steam. Because I'd been thinking about the question, why do we believe in things like human rights? Why do we believe in the idea of human value? Where does that come from? Could that be explained, the idea we have of justice, of right and wrong? Why do we bring into being documents of universal human rights? Where does that instinct come from? Can it be explained in purely material, atheistic terms, as just some kind of social contract we use to kind of get along better? Or is there something deeper at the heart of it? And it really came out for me in a conversation that I was able to have with Richard Dawkins. This happened during a debate he had at Oxford University with a well-known Christian thinker in the UK, John Lennox. And they had a wonderful debate at the Natural History Museum in Oxford University. And I was able to go to a sort of after party that they were having after the debate. And I got 10 minutes, my very first interview with Richard Dawkins, probably the best known atheist in the world. So I was very nervous, obviously, but we did have a fascinating moment in our interchange where I asked him about this subject of human value and how, as an atheist, he makes sense of the idea that we have value as human beings. How does he make sense of right and wrong on an atheist worldview? And this was the way it came about. I'm just going to quote verbatim the conversation we had and a surprising admission that Richard Dawkins made during it. I asked him, but Richard, if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favours is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad, that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say, well, the reason this is good is that it's good, and you don't really have any way to stand on that statement. And he replied, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. I said, well, therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that, but in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And you could say that. And you should say that if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist atheist like Richard Dawkins is. So why do we recoil in horror at the idea that our belief that rape is wrong is just the happenstance of the hand that socio-cultural forces of evolution happen to have dealt us? Why do we actually believe, no, there are some really right and some really wrong ways to treat other human beings, and that's not just kind of the happenstance of the culture we happen to live in right now. There's a definite right and wrong about this. This is the way that morality forces itself upon us. And I just wasn't satisfied with Richard Dawkins' answer. And most people that I've met, atheists included, aren't satisfied with that answer either. There's something different about why it makes sense that we believe in human value, in human rights. And it doesn't seem to sit well with a purely atheist understanding of the universe, in which these things are just whatever the kind of the status quo is at any moment in time. Our morality is just subjective in that sense. There's an objectivity. And I can only make sense of the idea that there is this kind of fundamental foundation to right and wrong, to what it means to be human, if there's a God, a moral lawgiver, who actually writes that within the kind of the reality of the universe. I don't see how you get to that view on a purely atheistic worldview. But again, Christianity has a ready explanation for this. It's written right there on page 1 of the Bible. It says humans are made in God's image. If that's true, then it invests every single human being, whatever their status, with infinite value and worth. It makes sense of this view that actually we all do have infinite value and worth. It's much easier to make sense of that sense of human value on a Christian worldview than an atheist one. But again, it's not just Christian apologists like me who are pointing this out. I think there are lots of interesting characters who are kind of coming to these conclusions in different ways. Again, one of the interesting secular intellectuals that I've been engaging with over the last few years is Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor from the Marvel films, I should say. They're a rather different Tom Holland, this one. He's a historian in the UK, and he hosts a very well listened to, very popular podcast called The Rest is History, probably the most popular history podcast in the world. And he's written a best-selling book called Dominion. And the reason I mention him in relation to this idea of human value is that he's spent a lot of time looking at the question from a historical point of view of why do we believe in the West in this idea of human value, human dignity? Why do we believe in compassion, helping the vulnerable, freedom, progress? Where do these ideas come from? Now, Tom Holland's story here is quite interesting, and he tells it in this book, Dominion, that he published a few years ago, because Tom Holland, any faith he had as a boy growing up, kind of had sputtered out by his teenage years. And he kind of, once he entered his adult career of writing popular historical works about the Greek and Roman world, he was very much, a happy agnostic. But the more time he spent researching and living in the sandals, if you like, of the Greco-Roman world, the more he realized how very alien their world was to him, especially their values. He realized this was a world where slavery was a de facto part of the economy, absolutely assumed. This was a world where the lives of women and children were cheap, were disposable in very many instances. This was a world where some people could be the sexual property of other people. If you were a Roman male, a senior male, then you could essentially have access to whoever you wanted. And he realized he, as a kind of modern liberal Westerner, had a completely different view about human value and dignity from the Greeks and the Romans. And he thought, well, where does my belief in human dignity and equality and compassion and freedom and progress come from? It obviously doesn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. And he realized it doesn't come from atheism either. Atheism is a kind of value-neutral thing. It doesn't really have a moral code to it. And he realized the place that had actually shaped who he was and the things he believed came from a very specific source, 2,000 years ago, a man called Jesus of Nazareth. And the movement that he had begun, and his followers continued, had completely revolutionized and shaped the world that Tom Holland now lives in. And he said to me, Justin, I struggle to believe in Christianity, but actually, when I think about it, I realize that when it comes to the things I believe about humans and about value, I realize that in almost every way I am a Christian. The world is so shaped by that Christian story in ways we've completely forgotten in the West. So many of the values people hold today, they don't realize where those values come from, and they come from the Christian Revolution. That's just the reality of it. Tom Holland is such an interesting example because, as well as going on this intellectual journey of realizing how his worldview has been completely shaped by the Christian story, he's kind of been reminding other people in the process. Because he has a very big platform, he's been kind of, again, putting a stone in the shoe of many of his secular colleagues and asking, well, can we hold on to these values in the absence of the Christian story? What happens when that story gets swept out of view? Can we continue to believe in human values if we don't have the story that actually gave them to us? And he's been on his own interesting kind of faith journey himself. He now finds himself quite frequently in church. He finds himself very attracted to the story of Christianity. You can read more about that in the book and in the podcast series. But Tom Holland is not alone in this area. There's a fascinating female thinker, Louise Perry, who grew up herself, again, as a kind of liberal Western female. She kind of was schooled in kind of liberal Western feminist kind of views of life, especially when it came to sexuality and relationships. But it was when she started working in a rape crisis center that she kind of had a shock to the system, and she started to think very differently about the sexual revolution. In fact, she ended up writing a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And what was interesting about this book when I read it is that Louise Perry, again, wasn't coming at this as a Christian, a person of faith. She had no faith whatsoever. But as she detailed the ways in which our kind of modern hookup, pornified culture, the effect that was having on people and relationships, she came to some very interestingly Christian conclusions about what might be the answer to this culture that we were living in. And she realized that there was this one funny old historical institution that had done quite a good job, despite its flaws, at putting guardrails, especially on male sexuality historically, and that had actually given a safe place for especially women and children to flourish and for families and whole cultures to develop. And it was this funny old institution called monogamous Christian marriage. And she just kind of discovered this kind of by accident as she was researching the book and realized, you know what, maybe there's something in this kind of Christian ethics that essentially got discarded in the 1960s. And she's been another super interesting voice asking, well, where does our belief in human value come from? Why do we exist in a culture that kind of has these guardrails and things? And again, she's going on this journey, looking at Christianity and asking, where does human value reside ultimately? People like Tom Holland and Louise Perry, I think, are just, again, these interesting people from outside the church who are asking us to reconsider whether what we're losing as we lose the Christian story of reality. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which ultimately the Christian worldview makes sense of that fundamental belief that still exists in most people, that we have intrinsic value and dignity. The final area where I think, if you're kind of comparing the Christian and atheist worldview, where I think there's a huge conversation going on in our culture at the moment, is the question of human purpose, the why question. And again, I believe God makes sense of human purpose in a way that the secular humanist atheist perspective cannot. Perhaps, again, one of the most interesting people talking in this area is the person I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Jordan Peterson. He's a somewhat controversial character in some ways, a bit of a player in the culture wars going on at the moment. But I was fascinated when I brought him on my show back in 2018 at the effect he was having at that time. Because here was a sort of rather eccentric Canadian psychology professor, but who had been drawing huge crowds, especially of young men, packing out auditoriums for 3-hour lectures on, of all things, the book of Genesis. And I wondered what was going on. People were emailing me about this guy and just all the people turning up to listen to him. And I discovered in the process of kind of looking into his story that actually, essentially, he was drawing a very similar demographic to the one that had been turning up for the New Atheists only 10 years or so before. It was kind of people who were searching, especially young men, looking for answers. But I think because they'd been let down by the empty promises in the end of New Atheism, they were looking for someone to give them a different kind of answer. And Jordan Peterson came along with a kind of a very simple message at one level, sort of stand up straight, put your shoulders back, tidy your bedroom. It was kind of very simple homespun advice almost, especially aimed at, as I say, at young men looking for meaning and purpose and a sense of identity. But the place he was ultimately pointing them back to was the Bible. He was constantly referencing the way in which this story, the Judeo-Christian story that has shaped the West, was the story that had given meaning and purpose and identity to many people over many generations. So I just found this guy absolutely fascinating. And I think he's a really good example of what's going on in our culture. There's a kind of a meaning crisis that's developed in our culture. And the way I would put it is this: as we've lost the Christian story in the West, as that has kind of gone into the back view mirror over time, people aren't necessarily any less religious than they used to be. They just get religious about different things. I mean, G.K. Chesterton, a Christian thinker, put it like this about 100 years ago. He said, once people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And what I think the New Atheists didn't realize was that as they kind of, if you like, finished off the job of trying to push Christianity out of view in the West, rather than clearing the way for science and reason and some kind of rationalist utopia, they actually opened up a void. Because people still need a story to make sense of their life. And science and reason, as I say, they're good for some things, but they won't give you a story that makes sense of your life. And so people, in the absence of the Christian story, have been filling that void with all kinds of other stories. And in our culture today, you can see what some of those stories are. On the progressive left, you've got stories around sexuality and identity. And very often those become the sacrosanct story for someone. That's the way they make sense of who they are. That gives them their meaning, their purpose, and their identity. That becomes, if you like, the new religion in many ways. Or it might be a kind of political mythologies on the right, a savior figure who becomes, your great hope in politics. And again, it's a story that I think takes the place, ultimately, of God. But none of these stories are enough. And the problem is these stories all bash up against each other and create these culture wars. And I think everyone's actually looking for the ultimate story, the story that got pushed aside. It's the Christian story that gives us true purpose and meaning and identity. And what I think we're seeing is people like Jordan Peterson seeing this meaning crisis, seeing that people are looking for these things, but not finding them in the stories they're currently telling themselves. And suddenly realizing, actually, there is this story that once made sense of us and made sense of our culture, and just pointing people back in the direction of it. Now, I don't know exactly where Jordan Peterson is himself on the God question. I did ask him in this interview that I had with him, well, what do you believe, Jordan? Do you believe in God? And he gave that well-known answer that he sometimes gives of, well, it depends what you mean by God. He kind of is quite hard to pin down exactly where he stands. But what I do know is, wherever he lands on the question, he's been pointing a lot of people towards God and towards Christianity. I've met a lot of people who he's kind of opened the intellectual door to take Christianity seriously again. And I find Jordan Peterson is just one among a number of characters. I've used him as one of the preeminent examples, but there's lots of people these days who are starting to question the new atheist view of reality and starting to realize that actually the Christian story has a lot to offer us. And as we lose that story, we may be losing something about what it is to be human. One of the most extraordinary things that happened as I was, after I released the book last year in September, just a couple of months later, an extraordinary viral article was written by a woman called Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, if you're not familiar with her, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a Somali-born person who fled Somalia under a kind of strict Islamic regime and came to the West to escape a forced marriage. And in the process, she became an atheist. She completely rejected religion. She wrote a best-selling book, anti-religious book called Infidel, and she very much became one of the sect of the new atheists. She was, if you like, the fifth horsewoman of the new atheism, sharing stages with some of those characters, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, counting them as her friends. And this was happening around the mid-2000s in this era of new atheism. So you could have knocked me over with a feather when I read an article published by Ayaan Hirsi Ali just in November last year titled, "Why I Am Now a Christian." And she wrote this article, which went viral at the time, explaining that she had come to the view that actually atheism, secular humanism, simply could not provide a reason for living to people in modern-day 21st century West. That actually there was no other worldview apart from the Christian worldview that could counter the forces of fundamentalist Islam, of the threats of dominant global powers like China and Putin, and what she sees as the threat of sort of left-wing progressive woke ideology as well, that she sees as a cancer in kind of academia and elsewhere. And she came to realize she essentially was converted intellectually by the Tom Holland thesis, that actually we owe all the values we hold dear in the West to the Christian story of reality. But this went hand in hand, it turned out, with a personal journey that Ayaan had been on, because she'd come to a place of experiencing a deep depression in her life, a real sense of nihilism, and a sense of not really having a reason to live. She was feeling suicidal, she was medicating with alcohol, she'd seen lots of therapists. She'd tried to kind of go down the secular humanist route of trying to understand her neuroses and trying to deal with them. It was only when she saw a therapist, only about a year and a half ago, who said to her, "Ayaan, I think you're spiritually bankrupt." And Ayaan said to her, "What do you mean? Are you saying I should pray?" And this therapist said, "Well, do you believe in God?" And she said, "Well, of course I don't. You know, people know I'm an atheist. The God I was raised with was a monster." And this therapist said to her, well, if you could believe in a God, if you could pray to a God, what kind of a God could you believe in? And Ayan says she started to describe the kind of God she could be willing to believe in. And she says, as she did that, she realized she was describing Jesus. And so she thought, well, maybe I don't need to invent a new God. Maybe I should look at this person who claimed to be God. And so she started praying. She started going to church. And she said, it was completely different to what I thought it would be. It completely transformed her thinking. She had this extraordinary conversion. She's since shared a stage with her friend Richard Dawkins to talk about this to a large audience. And it's so interesting because when you see someone who is, if you like, was the pinnacle of the new atheist persona, becoming a Christian, you know something's changing in the culture. In many ways, Ayan's story is a kind of perfect instance of what I was talking about in the book. And when I saw her story come out, I thought, goodness me, that's a real validation of what I think I've been seeing happening in the culture. This search for meaning, this search for purpose, if it can lead someone like Ayan Hirsi Ali to Christian faith, it could happen to anyone. And I've continued to engage with and bump into more and more of these stories of these secular intellectuals who were either turning towards faith or stepping into it. Another person, and I'll just finish with this story, is Molly Worthen, not as well known an individual as Ayan Hirsi Ali, but fascinating person I got to know about a year ago. And Molly is a fascinating example of where this phenomenon, I think, is heading. Molly was an agnostic pretty much all her adult working life. She's actually a professor of the history of religion at the University of North Carolina. And so she was actually not only a professor, but also a journalist. She was often reporting on the good, the bad, and the ugly of religion in North America for outlets like the New York Times, the Atlantic, and other journals. So she, if you like, knew the history of Christianity from the inside. She had every reason, arguably, to not believe. But interestingly, in August 2 years ago, she was baptized. And she told me the story of what happened. She was put on assignment by a journal to go and interview a well-known megachurch pastor in North Carolina, J.D. Greer. And she had done this a number of times before, and usually, they had a pleasant conversation. She did the interview, she filed her article, and that was the end of the conversation. But on this occasion, J.D. Greer kind of struck up a conversation with her and said, well, what do you believe, Molly? And she said, well, I'm kind of agnostic, I've never really been able to make my mind up on this thing. I don't think I'm kind of cut out to believe, basically. And he said, well, can I give you some homework? Because probably one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves is whether Jesus was who he claimed to be. And she said, yeah, I'm a kind of thinking person. I'll do some homework. And so he invited her to go and look into the evidence for Jesus Christ and the claim that he died and was raised to life again. And he kind of gave her a lot of reading resources. He put her in touch with some pretty interesting, influential Christian thinkers. She ended up in an email correspondence with Tim Keller while he was still alive, a well-known Christian thinker, and also in a correspondence with N.T. Wright, a well-known Bible historian. And she discovered, she told me, in the process of doing that, of just opening herself up to some of the best historians and evidence available, she said there was far more surprising and compelling evidence than I'd ever realized for the truth of, firstly, the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, but also this claim of the early church that he had died and raised again. And she said she found herself suddenly confronted by this question. And it went alongside again for her something of a meaning crisis in her life, a lot of existential questions she'd been asking. And suddenly she found it made sense. There was a kind of a truth at the center of Christianity. There was a real historical core. And in the end, to her own great surprise, she found herself being baptized by J.D. Greer that summer in the megachurch. Not the place she was expecting to find herself. She was kind of a snob when it came to megachurches, and she thought, no, that wouldn't be the place if I ever did become a Christian. But so she was God kind of had a surprise for her there as well. But I just find it fascinating. If it can happen to Molly Worthen, if it can happen to Ayan Hirsi Ali, and I'm bumping into more and more of these people, surprising converts to Christianity, and at the center of it is not just a philosophy or some kind of reasons why you should kind of culturally believe in Christianity. At the center of it, there's a person, Jesus Christ, that these people are ultimately coming to. And they're realizing that this person stands at the very center of history and culture. And they're starting to question whether we can make sense of our culture, of human existence, of human purpose, of human value, without Jesus Christ at the center of the story. Now, I don't know exactly where this is heading, but I do sense that something has changed in our culture. I'm bumping into more and more of these kinds of stories, both these interesting thinkers up here who are asking these new questions about God, but also something bubbling up from the ground level as well. I just sense there's a new spiritual hunger, especially among the youngest generation, the most unchurched, least religious generation. But actually there's an incredible openness. We're seeing a lot of this in some of the surveys coming out now. That they're the generation who have been told, you can make up your own story, you can be whoever you want to be. And that's the generation it's having the most detrimental effect on. We're seeing a mental health crisis. I think we can only live on the fumes of the Christian story, a long forgotten story for so long, until people get so desperate and so hungry that they're ready to hear the story again. And I think we might be just starting to enter that turning of the tide moment. I think, yes, the Christian story, the Christian faith has kind of gone a long way out. The sea of faith has retreated a long way. But I think the sea comes back in again. And I think we may be at one of those moments when God does something new. God has always worked in cycles. There's been many times in the history of Christendom where it looked like the church was dead, gone, and buried, but somehow something happened. There was a Wesley, a Whitfield, a new movement, a new breath of the Spirit, and I wonder if we're in one of those moments at the moment. And I can't put it better than G.K. Chesterton, who said essentially words to the effect that Christianity has died many deaths, but it's risen again because it has a God who knew his way out of the tomb. And I think that's true in our generation. A lot of people feel disillusioned, feel kind of a sense of, where is everything heading in our culture? I meet a lot of Christians who are kind of cynical almost about the church and about culture. I just want to give you a sense of encouragement tonight that actually God is not finished with the church. Yeah, there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of issues in our culture and in our churches, but actually God always does something new, something surprising. And I believe it's happening in our generation. And that actually, if we've got eyes to see and ears to hear, we might find that something's happening around us that actually is very exciting. And it's my hope and prayer that we'll be ready, if there is an incoming tide of meaning seekers, that we'll be ready to receive them, to answer the new questions that they're asking, and that God will once again see his church grow in our generation. Thank you, guys. God bless you.